She never expected the man who swept floors and wore second-hand shoes to own the penthouse above the city. In the glimmering pulse of Manhattan's skyline, there was a man named Daniel Mercer, known to Forbes as the tech visionary who built Lyra Dynamics from a basement code shack into a billion-dollar empire. He had everything: power, wealth, an intimidatingly sharp jawline, but what no headline could ever hint at was the one thing he lacked: trust. Ever since his ex-wife walked out on him and their twin daughters, Emma and Elise, for a glossier life in Monaco, Daniel had sworn off love. At least, the kind that recognized his bank account before his soul. But the girls were growing up fast, 8 and fierce, too clever for their age and too good at noticing the loneliness that hung around their father like his tailored coats. And one evening, while he was combing the tangled curls of Elisa's hair and half listening to Emma read out loud from a fantasy book, she stopped mid-sentence and said, "Daddy, when are you going to go on a date again?" That night, Daniel made a decision. If he was going to date again, she'd have to fall for him, not the Mercer Empire. He created a fake profile. No surname. No job listed. The profile photo? Just him in a flannel shirt at a food truck. No designer watches or hint of penthouse views. Within 2 weeks, he matched with her, Rhea Langford. No last name needed either. She was a literature professor, taught at NYU, loved coffee with too much cinnamon, and rescued pit bulls on Sundays. Her profile was quiet, thoughtful, real. The first date, he showed up at a dimly lit bistro in Brooklyn wearing jeans that had actually seen dust, and boots he hadn't worn since the factory days. She was already seated, reading Wuthering Heights with a wine glass untouched. Her hair was tied up like she hadn't really planned to impress anyone. That impressed him more than diamonds ever could. "I like your boots," she said first, with a slight smirk. "You look like a man who works with his hands." "I do," he said, thinking of his daily battles with boardrooms, algorithms, and the stock market. Not glamorous, but honest work. That was the beginning. Date after date, they met in bookstores, thrift cafes, jazz dives tucked between laundromats. He told her he was a freelance web designer. She told him about her students who quoted Kafka like prophets. They both confessed to a love for peanut butter sandwiches at 2 a.m. He never lied. But he never told her the whole truth either. The twins adored her, though she didn't know who they were. He introduced them on the third date as his nieces. Emma had raised an eyebrow, but played along. Rhea had a way of listening that made even shy Elise spill secrets about her fear of thunderstorms. She didn't try to buy their affection. She built it, moment by moment. It was the 7th date when everything began to crack. They were sitting under an old maple tree in Central Park, sandwiches between them, her laugh still echoing from a joke he'd made about failed pancake flips. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced, then stiffened. Daniel noticed. Something wrong. She hesitated, then said, "No, just my ex. He's back in town. He's not a good man. Used to manipulate, twist things. Always said I'd end up with someone rich and cruel." Daniel looked away. It burned more than he expected. "What do you think about rich people?" he asked, testing her. "I think wealth makes people more of what they already are. If you're kind, you'll be kinder. If you're selfish, well," she shrugged. "Money just turns up the volume." That night, as he watched her walk away, his phone buzzed. "Board meeting rescheduled to 9 a.m., sir. You'll be expected to preview the Monaco merger. ****. He sighed. The two worlds were colliding faster than he'd planned. And then came the night of the charity gala. She invited him as her +1, not knowing, of course, that he was the secret benefactor funding the education wing of her university. She wore a navy gown that left him speechless. He wore a rented tux, resisting the temptation to show up in one of his bespoke suits. Everything was fine. Until the dean introduced the evening's anonymous patron. "We owe our deepest thanks to Mr. Daniel Mercer, without whom the Langford Fellowship would not exist." Rhea froze beside him. Her glass trembled. Her eyes met his, sharp, confused, betrayed. "You're Daniel Mercer?" she asked, voice barely audible over the clink of silverware and applause. He nodded slowly. "I was going to tell you. I just needed you to see me first." She laughed once. It wasn't kind. So the struggling web designer with the borrowed boots and peanut butter midnight cravings was a billionaire the whole time? "I wasn't pretending to be someone else," he said softly. "Just hiding the part that usually scares people off, or draws them in for the wrong reasons." She set down her glass. "You think I care about your money? That I'd have looked at you differently if I knew? You didn't give me the choice to prove you wrong. I was trying to protect what we had." "No," she said, stepping back. "You were protecting yourself." She walked out of the gala. Daniel stood there, applause still echoing. He felt like a fraud. Not for his deception, but for not trusting her to be who she said she was. The twins noticed her absence. Days passed. Emma asked, "Did she go away forever?" Daniel didn't have the heart to answer. Then one evening, a package arrived at his door. No return address. Just a hardbound book, *Wuthering Heights. Inside, an inscription. To the man who thought he had to lie to be loved. Real love doesn't care how high you build your tower, only if the doors are open. He rushed out, heart pounding, into the summer twilight. The city buzzing and humming beneath the descending dusk like it was holding its breath for him. Daniel didn't bother calling his driver. He ran, down the front steps of his brownstone, across the block, through traffic lights blinking amber, past cafes and food carts, his lungs burning but his heart beating louder than it ever had. He didn't know exactly where she was, but his instincts carried him like a compass. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was desperation. But something in him knew she hadn't truly walked out of his life. Not yet. He stopped outside her apartment building in Soho, breathless, sweat beading across his temples, tie crooked. He buzzed once. Then again. Silence. A light flickered on in a window 2 floors up. Then her voice crackled through the intercom. "Daniel." His mouth was dry. "I got your book." A pause. Then, "Why are you here?" "Because I should have trusted you. And I didn't. And if there's a way to fix that, I'll spend the rest of my life finding it." Another pause. Longer this time. "I don't know what I am to you anymore," she said, voice trembling. "I thought I was falling in love with someone who saw the world like I did. I thought you were someone simple, honest. But then you weren't. And it wasn't just the money. It was the performance." He rested his forehead against the intercom, closed his eyes. "It wasn't a performance. I didn't change who I was. I just left out the parts one was scared would change how you saw me." A crackle. Then a soft buzz. The door clicked open. She stood on the second-floor landing when he climbed the stairs, barefoot, wearing an oversized sweater, her hair slightly wet like she'd just showered. She looked smaller without the makeup, softer than the confident woman he'd met at the bistro weeks ago. She didn't speak as he stepped into the apartment, but she didn't stop him either. The place smelled of sandalwood and old books, the scent of something familiar, something sacred. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," he said after a beat. "I came to tell you I see what I did wrong. I thought being poor would make me invisible enough for someone to love me without expectation. But I forgot that love isn't about hiding. It's about being seen, and choosing anyway." She sat on the edge of the couch. "I've spent years trying to build a life that felt real. My ex, he made everything transactional. Compliments had a price. Affection had a script. I told myself if I ever let someone in again, it would be someone who showed up honest." Daniel sat across from her, elbows on knees. "And I told myself that if anyone loved me again, it'd be because they didn't know who I was. Because I didn't think I could trust anyone to love me without incentives." She looked down, fingers tangled in her sleeves. "That's the tragedy, isn't it? Two people trying so hard not to be hurt, they end up hurting each other. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, a small velvet pouch. "This isn't what you think," he said quickly when her eyes widened. "It's not jewelry." She took it hesitantly. Inside was a tiny wooden charm, a carved fox, worn smooth. She held it up with a confused smile. "Elise made that. Said I should give it to someone clever and brave. Someone who didn't run when she talked about monsters under her bed." Rhea blinked. "You told me they were your nieces." He smiled faintly. "They're my daughters. Emma and Elise. Their mom left when they were 4. I didn't know how to explain that to you without feeling pitied or judged. Or worse, like I was testing you." She held the charm tightly now. Her shoulders had softened, but her eyes still searched his face like there was a storm behind them. "They talk about you," he added. "Emma says you laugh like you're in on a secret no one else knows. Elise asked if she could give you her favorite book next time." A beat. "There's going to be a next time?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I hope so," he said. "If you'll let me earn it." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't tense now. It was suspended, sacred, full of things unspoken. She stood slowly, walked to the bookshelf, and tucked the fox charm between 2 thick novels. "Then don't tell me you're sorry," she said. "Just show up. Day after day. No more pretending. No more tests." He nodded, rising. "Deal." The next morning, Daniel didn't go to the office. Instead, he walked Emma and Elise to school himself, hand in hand, their chatter a balm he hadn't realized he'd needed so desperately. They passed a bakery, and Elise asked if they could get the cinnamon things Rhea likes. He promised they would. Later that afternoon, he stood outside NYU, a cup carrier in hand. Students buzzed around him like bees. He looked entirely out of place. Tailored coat, black scarf, polished boots, but he waited anyway. She stepped out, surprised to see him. "You remembered," she said, taking the cup. "I wrote it on my palm," he replied with a grin, showing her the faint ink stain. "I told you, too much cinnamon makes it weird. I like weird." They walked in silence down the block, sipping coffee like it was some ancient ritual. They didn't need to say anything more. At least not yet. Over the next few weeks, they found a rhythm. Quiet dinners with the girls. Walks in the park. Lazy Sundays where the world seemed to pause. He took her to the house upstate. Not the mansion, but the little cabin by the lake where he used to go to clear his head. They cooked over a wood stove, danced barefoot on creaking floorboards, and watched the twins chase fireflies like they were made of light and magic. And slowly, the fortress Daniel had built brick by brick over the years began to crumble. With every joke Rhea made. With every story she told. With every night she curled beside him, whispering thoughts like secrets into the quiet. But not everything was safe forever. One evening, just before Thanksgiving, Daniel received a message. It was from Clarissa, his ex-wife. "I'll be in New York for a few days. I want to see the girls." He didn't respond immediately. But the next morning, she called. "I don't want to fight, Daniel," she said, voice polished and cool. "But they're my daughters too." "They don't even remember your voice," he replied, sharper than intended. "I made mistakes. I want to fix them." He didn't know what terrified him more, Clarissa's sudden interest, or the fact that she could still twist things with a single sentence. When he told Rhea that night, she didn't say anything at first. Then she asked, "Do you think she's here for them? Or for something else?" "I don't know," he said. "But I'm not letting her waltz in and confuse them again. Not after how long it's taken to make them feel safe." Rhea touched his hand. "Then we don't let her. But we don't shut the door so hard that they grow up wondering if we were fair." The meeting with Clarissa happened in a neutral place, a quiet cafe in the Upper East Side. Daniel, the girls, and Clarissa seated at a round table that felt like a battlefield. Clarissa wore a white coat and red lipstick, like an ad campaign for high-end regret. The girls were polite, cautious. Elise clung to Daniel's arm. Emma asked questions like a lawyer in training. "You've been in Monaco?" she asked flatly. "For 4 years." Clarissa nodded, sipping her tea. "Yes. But I've thought of you every day." Elise stared at her. "Then why didn't you call?" Clarissa faltered. Daniel didn't speak. He let the girls see her cracks for themselves. By the end of the lunch, it was clear. They weren't angry. Just unmoved. Detached in a way that meant they'd grown without her. Rhea met them outside afterward. The girls ran to her, arms thrown around her waist. Daniel stood there, hands in his coat pockets, watching the pieces of his life rearrange themselves in real time. That night, as they tucked into leftovers and Rhea helped Elise with a science project, Daniel watched the scene unfold and felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear. Not worry. But awe. The kind of awe that comes when you realize you're watching your life begin again. Not with fanfare, but with gentle persistence. But the past doesn't always fade so easily. 3 days later, a tabloid headline hit the internet. Tech mogul's secret girlfriend, Rhea Langford exposed. The photo was grainy, taken through a long lens outside the bookstore. But it was unmistakably them. The article painted Rhea as an opportunist, a nobody academic who had strategically entered the life of the mysterious CEO Daniel Mercer while posing as a simple educator. The comments were worse. Rhea saw it before Daniel did. She called him but didn't wait for an answer. She was already outside his building by the time he reached his phone. Her hands shook as she held up her screen. "I thought I could handle your world," she said. "But I didn't know it would turn me into a headline." He looked at her, heart sinking. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I had privacy teams. I kept everything quiet." "You can't keep people quiet forever," she said. "Not when the truth is worth money." He stepped closer. "Do you want to walk away?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I love the girls. I think I love you. But I don't love being hunted." He reached for her hand. "Then let me protect you. Not by hiding you, but by standing beside you. Loudly. Publicly. If they want a story, we'll give them one that's real." She stared at him for a long moment, tears shining but unshed, then nodded. That weekend, he released a statement. A photo of them with the girls, in sweaters and messy hair, laughing over burnt pancakes. "Love isn't a scandal. It's the one honest thing I've built without a business plan. Her name is Rhea Langford, and she is not secret, she's sacred." The press didn't know what to do with that. And slowly, the noise began to fade. And in the stillness that followed, something profound began to take root, deeper than love, heavier than infatuation. It was a shared resilience. The kind that couldn't be engineered, packaged, or sold. The girls noticed the change first. Emma, precocious as ever, started referring to Rhea as our unofficial stepmom, a title that made Daniel nearly choke on his coffee the first time she said it, and made Rhea flush red, but smile nonetheless. And Elise, quieter and more sensitive, began drawing pictures of their family that included Rhea, holding a fox charm, always standing right beside their father. Not behind him. Beside him. Winter approached with its velvet dusk and frosted windows. The city turned silver overnight. Daniel had never looked forward to Christmas before. Not since the old days, when holidays meant expensive catering and polite company in tuxedos. But this year, they were planning something different. Rhea insisted on a real tree, not the artificial one from storage. They picked it out together from a lot in Brooklyn, hauling it into the SUV with the girls squealing at every pothole. It wasn't the biggest tree, or the most symmetrical, but it was perfect. In the living room of his penthouse, the same one that used to feel like a museum, Daniel watched as Rhea stood barefoot on the coffee table, trying to hang a star while Emma directed her like a tiny CEO. Elise was curled up with the dog Rhea had rescued just 2 weeks earlier, a pit bull named Hugo who snored like an old man and followed Rhea everywhere. Daniel couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't performative. It wasn't for social media. There were no cameras, no press releases. Just the quiet echo of laughter filling a space that used to echo with silence. And yet, even as joy blossomed, a thread of unease began to unravel in the background. It began with a phone call from his general counsel. Daniel took it late one night while everyone else was asleep. Rhea stirred beside him as he slipped out of bed and into his office. "There's been a breach," said Veronica, his lawyer. "We don't know who yet, but someone's been leaking internal documents. Early merger drafts, private board memos. We think it's someone on the inside." Daniel sighed, fingers pressed to his temple. "What about our NDA coverage?" "We're covered legally. But the leaks are too precise, too timed. And here's the worst part, it's being funneled through a reporter at the Ledger, someone who has personal access to you." He froze. "Personal access?" "Yes. And you should know." Her voice hesitated. "They asked for comment on a confidential custody clause in your divorce agreement. About your daughters." His blood ran cold. "They're not supposed to have that. Not unless Clarissa." "We can't prove anything yet," Veronica said gently. "But be careful. This is getting personal." He ended the call and sat in silence. The city glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it felt distant, disconnected. Someone was trying to rip apart the life he'd finally begun to rebuild. Not his company. Him. And the worst part was the suspicion, poisonous, creeping in like fog. Who had access to both him and his personal life? Who would want to sabotage both the merger and his family? He thought of Clarissa. Of the way she'd smiled politely at the girls, but looked at Rhea like a problem to solve. And for one wild, irrational second, he thought of Rhea. But no. That was impossible. She hadn't even known his last name until weeks into their courtship. She'd never shown interest in his money. She'd never asked about shares or stock or trust funds. In fact, she'd once told him, over candlelight and leftover pasta, that the only number she wanted from him was how many pages he could read before falling asleep. He shook his head. No. Not her. Still, he told her about the breach the next morning. Carefully, with measured tone, as they brewed coffee. She listened silently, stirring cream into her cup. When he finished, she looked up. "You think Clarissa's behind it?" "She has motive. And access. And she hates the idea of not being the center of attention." Rhea considered that, then said, "Then let's make it harder for her." "How?" "Bring me in. Not just as your girlfriend. As your shield. If she wants to attack us, make it so we're unshakable. Let me speak. Let me be public. Let her see that this isn't a weakness." He looked at her, surprised. "You're not scared." "I am," she said. "But love without risk is just convenience." So he did it. At the next Lyra Dynamics charity event, a black tie evening at the Met, they walked in together, hand in hand. Rhea wore a dress the color of ink, her hair swept back, her eyes defiant. Not as a trophy. Not as a tag-along. But as a partner. Daniel's PR team coordinated it quietly. No press statement, no announcement. Just visibility. Presence. When Clarissa saw them, her expression barely changed, but her eyes flicked between Rhea and the girls, who had arrived later with his sister. And for the first time, Daniel saw fear in Clarissa's composure. Later that evening, Rhea leaned in and whispered, "She knows she's already lost." But the storm wasn't over yet. 2 days later, a second leak appeared, this one uglier. An anonymous source claimed that Daniel had used his daughters as props in a romantic scheme to mislead a woman for emotional manipulation. The blog post cited unnamed insiders, screenshots from what looked like private family messages, and accusations of orchestrated fatherhood. The backlash was immediate. His company's stock trembled. Investors demanded explanations. Board members convened emergency meetings. Social media split in half. Supporters called it tabloid garbage, while critics accused him of weaponizing fatherhood for optics. Daniel's hands shook as he read the article. But it was the attached screenshots that turned his blood cold. They were real. Not recent, but old. From the first week he and Ria had begun dating. When he'd texted his assistant about arranging a low-profile date location, and when he told his sister he wasn't sure if Ria was real, or just another Clarissa. The texts were taken out of context, but the damage was in the framing. He stared at the screen, jaw clenched, breath shallow. And Ria, sitting across from him, read them too. Slowly. Silently. Then she said, "So in the beginning, I was a test." "No," he said immediately. "It wasn't like that. I was terrified. I didn't know what I was doing. I was trying to protect the girls. Myself. I didn't know you yet. But you suspected I might be fake," she said quietly. "Just another Clarissa." He leaned forward. "I was wrong. And I've spent every day since then trying to prove that to you. Don't let these twisted words undo what we've built." She stood, arms folded tightly around herself. "It's not the words, Daniel. It's the doubt. You still don't see how little you trusted me at the start." "I trust you now," he said. "But the people around you don't," she whispered. "Your world doesn't. They still think I'm a threat to your narrative." "You're not a threat," he said. "You're the reason I survived it." But her silence said more than her words ever could. The next morning, Ria didn't come to breakfast. By noon, she'd left the penthouse. There was no note. Just the fox charm, left on the counter beside the coffee machine. Daniel stared at it for a long time, unable to move. The girls noticed her absence immediately. "Where's Ria?" Elise asked, pulling at his sleeve. He knelt beside her, heartbreaking. She needed some space. Grown-ups get confused sometimes. Emma crossed her arms. "You messed up again, didn't you?" He didn't answer. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, he picked up his phone and called her. It rang. Then went to voicemail. Again. And again. For 3 days, she didn't respond. And then, she did. One line. "Meet me at the library. 9 p.m. No press. No security. Just you." Daniel stared at the message. The library. Where they had their third date. Where she read poetry to him in a whisper so soft it made his chest ache. Where he'd first realized she wasn't just someone he wanted. She was someone he needed. He arrived early. Waited in the lobby. The city felt strangely quiet outside, as if holding its breath for what might happen next. She arrived 5 minutes late. No makeup. No performance. Just Ria. He stood, heart pounding. "I don't know what to say," he began. She cut him off. "Then listen." He sat. She stood across from him, arms crossed, voice even. "I understand why you were cautious. I understand why you were scared. But I'm not interested in being someone's exception. I want to be someone's choice. Every day. Without conditions. Without tests." "You are," he said. "You always have been. Even when I was too blind to say it." She exhaled. Then moved closer. "Then tell me. Not in a text. Not in a press statement. Tell me now. Without the suit. Without the headlines. Just you." He looked up at her. And for once, didn't speak from logic or strategy. Just truth. "I love you. Not the idea of you. Not the version I tried to hide from. You. The woman who made peanut butter sandwiches at midnight. The one who taught my daughters how to trust again. The one who reminded me what it meant to feel. If you walk away now, I'll let you. But I'll never stop loving you." Silence. Then she walked forward, sat down beside him, and took his hand. "I love you too," she whispered. "But next time you get scared, don't run behind walls. Run to me." He nodded, blinking fast. They sat there for a long time, fingers intertwined, the library quiet except for the steady rhythm of their breathing. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and slow, as if the city itself was exhaling, relieved, for a moment, that something beautiful had survived the storm. The snow came down in whispering flurries as they stepped out into the night. Her hand still nestled in his like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. The city glowed with winter lights, storefronts framed in gold, street lamps haloed by snowfall, taxis sloshing by with their tires whispering over half-frozen asphalt. Daniel hailed none of them. They walked. They didn't need words. The silence was a balm, deep and shared, not the empty kind that begged to be filled, but the sacred kind, the kind that held the weight of everything they'd survived to arrive here. He glanced at her as they turned the corner on 14th Street, her face framed by her scarf, lashes dusted with snowflakes, cheeks flushed from cold and emotion. She didn't look fragile anymore. She looked certain, grounded, like she had decided what kind of life she wanted and dared anyone to pull her from it again. When they reached her apartment, she paused in front of the door, fingers on the knob, then turned to him. "Come up." He nodded, heart pounding for reasons beyond desire. It was the invitation he'd once longed for and later, feared he might never receive again. Inside, the lights were low. Hugo, her pit bull, barely raised his head from the couch before letting out a lazy, approving sigh and curling back up into a warm ball of trust. Daniel took off his coat, stood awkwardly near the bookshelf, suddenly unsure of the script now that there was no script. She poured 2 glasses of wine and handed him one. Then, without speaking, she sat down on the floor, back to the couch, legs stretched out across the rug. He joined her. Their shoulders touched. The clock ticked quietly in the corner. Finally, she said, "I kept thinking about that first night at the bistro. How we talked about who we really were." He laughed under his breath. "It's ironic, isn't it? That the man pretending to be broke ended up being the most exposed." She tilted her head toward him. "You weren't pretending. You were protecting." "I thought I was," he said. "But then I realized I was hiding. There's a difference." She nodded slowly. "I get that. I do. I've hidden before too. Behind books. Behind lectures. Behind other people's stories because it felt safer than writing my own." He turned toward her. "So what now?" She looked at him, searching. "Now. We rewrite." They stayed like that for hours, swapping pieces of themselves like they were laying out puzzle parts to see what fit. Childhood memories. Career regrets. The night Rhea found out her father had died and cried into her dog's fur until morning. The day Daniel signed the paperwork for Lyra Dynamics and realized success didn't taste like he thought it would. The first time Rhea gave a lecture on Bronte and forgot every word because she saw her ex in the front row, smirking. The first time Daniel saw Emma take care of Elise after a nightmare and realized he'd raised 2 warriors. It was dawn when they fell asleep on the couch, limbs tangled under a shared blanket, snow still drifting past the windows. Neither one of them had planned for this, for love to emerge from subterfuge and chaos, but it had. Not perfect. Not fairy tale. Real. The next few weeks became a blur of recalibration. Daniel tightened his inner circle, launched an investigation into the leak, and eventually discovered what he had feared. Clarissa had been working with a former Lyra board member, leaking details to undermine Daniel's credibility as a father in preparation for a custody challenge she'd been quietly planning. Rhea was in the room when his legal team presented the evidence. Clarissa's voice, captured in a recorded call. "He's built his image on being the perfect dad. If we take that apart, everything else falls." Daniel didn't flinch. But Rhea saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers dug into the armrest. Afterward, they sat on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the city blanketed in snow. "She's not going to stop," Rhea said. "She's going to use whatever she can. You, me, the girls." "I know," he said. "But I'm not afraid of her anymore." Rhea looked at him, brow furrowed. "Why not?" "Because this time," he said softly, "I'm not alone." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulder. The city glowed beneath them, but it was the warmth of her body against his that anchored him, not the skyline. Still, the custody hearing loomed. Clarissa had filed formal papers, challenging the terms of their original agreement, citing Daniel's questionable romantic entanglements and lack of stable domestic environment. It was a weak argument, but it was loud. Tabloids feasted on it. Social media swarmed. Billionaire dad's girlfriend questioned in court battle became a trending headline for nearly 48 hours. Rhea offered to step back, to disappear from public view until the storm passed. But Daniel wouldn't allow it. "If I let you go to make things easier," he told her, "then I never deserved you to begin with." The hearing was set for mid-January. Daniel arrived with his legal team in sleek gray suits, nerves steel-wrapped but thrumming. Rhea came too, though she wasn't required. She sat in the back of the courtroom, dressed plainly, holding a small paperback in her lap like armor. Clarissa was radiant as ever, all designer precision and sympathetic smiles for the cameras. But inside the courtroom, her strategy quickly began to unravel. The judge, an older woman with no tolerance for theatrics, saw through the smokescreen. She questioned Clarissa's motives, her lack of consistent contact, her sudden interest in the girls' lives after years of absence. And then Rhea was called to the stand. Daniel hadn't expected that. Nor had Clarissa. But the judge had read every tabloid, every blog post. She wanted to know who this woman really was, the one now inseparable from Daniel Mercer and his daughters. Rhea walked to the stand like she was walking into a lecture hall. Calm. Measured. Strong. "Miss Langford," the judge said, "you've been the subject of a fair amount of media attention. Why do you think that is?" Rhea smiled gently. "Because I fell in love with someone the world considers valuable in a very specific way." "And what is that way?" "Money. Status. Power. And how do you see him?" She turned slightly, meeting Daniel's eyes. "As a father. As a man who brushes his daughter's hair when she's afraid of the dark. As someone who tries so hard not to be broken that he forgets he's allowed to be human. I see him as someone who hides his heart because it's the most vulnerable, precious part of him." The judge paused. "Do you live with Mr. Mercer?" "Not officially. But I've spent most of the last 2 months with him and the girls." "And in that time, have you witnessed anything that would indicate a lack of stability?" Rhea shook her head. "Only love. Only patience. Only healing." The courtroom was silent. Clarissa sat stone-faced. Daniel's attorney leaned back with the faintest smile. The judge issued her ruling 2 days later. The custody agreement would remain unchanged. Clarissa's petition was dismissed with prejudice. But more than that, she issued a quiet warning in her written opinion, noting that manipulation of familial dynamics for personal gain will not be tolerated. Daniel didn't celebrate with champagne or speeches. He went home, made cocoa with the girls, and read aloud from the secret garden while Rhea curled up beside them with Hugo asleep on her feet. Later that night, while the twins slept and the snow whispered at the windows again, Daniel and Rhea lay together in bed, the fox charm now hanging from a string on her nightstand. "I've been thinking," she murmured. "Dangerous." She poked him. "I mean it. About us. About next steps." He turned to face her fully. "Tell me." She hesitated. "You know I love you." He nodded. "I never doubted it. But I don't want to get married because the world expects it. Or because it makes headlines go away. Or because of a legal document." "Okay," he said slowly. "I want to do it because one morning we wake up and realize we can't imagine another sunrise apart. Because the girls are asking when we're going to make it official. Because we want it, not because we need it." Daniel leaned in and kissed her gently. "Then I'll wait for that morning. And every morning until it comes." And as the city slept around them, wrapped in quiet snow and softened lights, they held each other in the silence between one chapter and the next, 2 lives no longer colliding, but intertwined, indivisible, and rising together, steady as dawn. Winter thawed slowly that year, reluctant to surrender its hold on the city. Dirty snowbanks shrank into gray puddles, sunlight stretched longer across the skyline, and the mornings began to hum with promise instead of frostbite. Daniel Mercer found himself more at ease than he'd ever been, which was a strange feeling for a man who'd lived most of his life in a constant state of preparation. For success, for failure, for betrayal, for lawsuits, for women like Clarissa. But not for this. Not for domestic happiness that bloomed like morning coffee and lazy Saturdays. Not for warm fingers curling around his wrist at breakfast, or Hugo climbing into bed at 6 a.m. with the stealth of a boulder, or the girls whispering jokes to Rhea over the dinner table that used to feel so cavernously empty. Daniel had always believed peace would bore him. That quiet would make him restless. But it didn't. It softened him. Made space for him to notice things, like the way Rhea always smiled slightly before opening a book, or how Elise sometimes rubbed her thumb against her palm when she was nervous, a tiny tick he never saw before, and how Emma had started humming when she brushed her teeth, off-key and confident. One Sunday afternoon, he found himself in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, apron on, helping Emma and Elise decorate cookies shaped like hearts, books, and little foxes. Rhea leaned against the doorway with her phone, pretending to check emails but clearly snapping photos. Daniel turned, caught her, and arched an eyebrow. "You're documenting the world's worst batch of cookies?" She smirked. "They're not bad. They're interpretive." Emma held up one, icing dripping down one side. "This one's a meteorite." Daniel pointed at a blob with legs. "And this?" Elise shrugged. "That's Hugo." He glanced at the dog, fast asleep on the rug. "He's going to be flattered." They ended up eating half of them before they'd cooled, sitting on the floor, their knees touching, sugar sticking to their fingers, the world outside forgotten. It was, in every measurable sense, a perfect moment. But Daniel knew enough about the world to know perfection had a short half-life. Trouble returned quietly, days later, wrapped not in scandal or leaked emails, but in a letter, cream-colored, embossed, hand-delivered by courier. Rhea opened it while sorting the mail and handed it to him wordlessly. It was from Clarissa's lawyers. A formal notice. She had filed an appeal, citing new evidence, claiming the judge in the previous hearing had shown bias, requesting a re-examination of Daniel's role as a cohabitating guardian, introducing undue maternal influence on the children. Rhea didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The weight of it was instant, the anxiety tangible. Daniel folded the letter slowly, controlled. "It's a delay tactic," he said. "She knows she can't win. But if she makes us uncomfortable, she thinks she wins by default." Rhea met his gaze. "Do you want me to stay somewhere else? Until it's resolved." He reached across the counter, took her hand. "Do you want to stay somewhere else?" She shook her head, firm. "Then I'm not going anywhere." He pulled her close, kissed her forehead. But the heat of that letter lingered long after they'd gone to bed, haunting his dreams, curling at the edge of his thoughts like smoke. Because this time, the cost wasn't just reputation. It wasn't about losing control of a company or being ridiculed in the press. This was about the girls. His daughters. His world. And someone, his ex-wife, his past, the entire structure he'd once tried so hard to walk away from, was trying to rip that from under him again. The appeal hearing wasn't for another 2 months, but the shadows crept in early. Paparazzi returned. Not in swarms, but just enough to snap a photo when he and Rhea walked the girls home from school. Rumors cropped up again, fabricated arguments, fake stories, speculation about Rhea's supposed agenda. Daniel's legal team worked overtime to manage the noise, but the stress bled through the cracks. Emma grew quieter, her once endless questions replaced by short nods. Elise clung to Hugo more than usual. Rhea stayed strong, but there were nights when Daniel found her sitting up alone in the living room, eyes glassy, book in her lap untouched. "I'm not scared of the truth," she said one night when he came to sit beside her. "I'm scared the truth doesn't matter to people who've already decided their version of it." He didn't have an answer. He just took her hand and held it until her pulse steadied under his. And then one Friday, an envelope arrived not for Daniel, but for Rhea. It was from a publisher. Her manuscript, one she'd quietly submitted a year ago, before she ever met Daniel, had been accepted. A novel. A work of literary fiction inspired by her years as a professor, her experiences with abandonment, love, and identity. It was scheduled for spring release. Daniel read the letter over her shoulder, breath-catching. "You did it." She smiled, stunned, hands shaking slightly. "I didn't think anyone would want it. It's not commercial. It's honest. That's rarer." She hesitated. "There's a scene, loosely based on you." "Let me guess. Brooding billionaire with emotional constipation." "No, that's the sequel." They laughed, for the first time in days, and he pulled her into a hug that turned into a kiss that deepened into something more. Something raw and healing, two people clinging to the only thing that made sense in a world that often didn't. But with the book came interviews, press, interest, which meant more exposure. Daniel watched her navigate it with grace. She declined most public appearances, but agreed to one radio segment and a literary roundtable. She spoke plainly, eloquently, always deflecting questions about him and the girls. Until one host, snide, polished, too used to digging, asked, "So you fell in love with a billionaire? That's not quite your average English professor narrative, is it?" Rhea smiled politely. "No, it's not. But I didn't fall in love with a billionaire. I fell in love with a man who made peanut butter sandwiches for his daughters at midnight and reads bedtime stories with different voices for every character. The money came after." The clip went viral. Not because of the content, but because of how she said it, with quiet conviction, undeniable truth, and no hint of performance. For a moment, the tides shifted. Public opinion began to soften. Even Daniel's board members, who had once cautioned him about the optics of his personal life, privately admitted Rhea had done what no PR team could, humanized him. But Clarissa was not finished. The day before the appeal hearing, she filed a restraining petition, accusing Rhea of interfering with parental rights, and submitting a photo of Emma holding her hand in public, claiming it was coerced affection. It was absurd, unfounded, insulting. But it made it into the courtroom. The judge this time was different. New, unfamiliar, young, cautious, less inclined to make a ruling that might spark public backlash. Daniel sat in the courtroom, fists clenched, jaw set, while Clarissa's legal team tried to paint his home as unstable, overly influenced by Rhea, too far removed from the original parenting agreement. When Rhea took the stand again, the lawyer tried a different approach. "You claim to love the children?" "Yes," Rhea said without flinching. "Are you aware that inserting oneself into a fractured family dynamic can be emotionally manipulative for the minors involved?" "I'm aware that loving someone doesn't make you a villain," she replied. The lawyer pressed. "Do you plan to marry Mr. Mercer?" Rhea paused. "We haven't set a date." "But you've discussed it." "Not formally. We've focused on building stability first." "So your presence in their lives is conditional?" "No," Rhea said, voice steady. "It's chosen. Chosen every day. And that's more powerful than a contract." Daniel wanted to stand and applaud. But he sat frozen, his heart pounding, knowing too well that truth in court didn't always win over performance. The hearing stretched over 2 days. And when the ruling finally came, it was cautious, upholding the original custody agreement for now, but opening the door for future evaluation, contingent on behavioral reviews and monitored interactions between the children and both parents. It wasn't a loss. But it wasn't a win either. As they left the courthouse, Daniel squeezed Rhea's hand. "We hold the line," he murmured. "That's all we do. Every day. We hold it." She nodded, tears threatening behind her lashes. "We will." The girls were waiting at home, unaware of the legal tightrope their futures had just walked. Emma met them at the door, holding up a poster she'd made for school titled, "My Hero." It had a drawing of Daniel, a dog, two little girls, and a woman with a book in her hand. "You're in it," she told Rhea. Elise tugged at her sleeve. "And you have a cape." That night, Daniel stood on the balcony once again, staring out at the city that had watched him rise, fall, and rise again. Rhea joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "I never thought I'd fight this hard for something so simple," he said quietly. "That's what makes it real," she whispered into his back. "Anything easy to lose was never worth this much to begin with." They stood in silence, wind brushing past them like a ghost. And somewhere inside, Daniel felt it again. That pull, that whisper, that stillness that meant something was about to shift. Not the end of the storm. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of their calm. The calm didn't come in a wave, but in fragments. It showed up in the morning coffee Daniel made without asking how she wanted it, because by now, he just knew. It arrived in the silence between words at night, the kind that no longer held tension, only familiarity. The storm hadn't passed entirely, there were always embers smoldering at the edge of their life, but something had changed. They weren't reacting anymore. They were choosing, building, holding the line, together. It had been 2 weeks since the court ruling. The media, hungry and fickle, had moved on to newer scandals, newer flames. Clarissa had gone quiet again, retreating behind her curated life. There were whispers that her backers had started pulling out. Board connections, investors, the high society who once clung to her name like a fashion label. She hadn't just lost a case. She'd lost credibility. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't even talk about it. Instead, he focused on what came next. The girls had started referring to Rhea's apartment as the bookhouse. Emma wanted to redecorate the living room with more cozy lights, while Elise had asked to paint a mural on the hallway wall. Rhea had said yes, of course. And Daniel, watching it all, realized that the once temporary corners of their lives had begun turning permanent without permission. It was never a conversation, never a calendar date. Just a quiet migration from mine to ours. One Saturday morning, Elise climbed into bed between them, clutching a notebook she'd been scribbling in for days. "What's this?" Rhea asked, groggy but smiling. Elise pushed the notebook toward them, opening it to the first page. The Mercer Langford family book. Daniel blinked. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "We're writing our story," she said matter-of-factly. "Like an autobiography. Except for all of us. And we want it printed." Rhea laughed softly, her fingers gently smoothing the page. "Printed where?" Emma shrugged. "Wherever grown-ups do it. Amazon." Daniel couldn't help but grin. "I think I know a few people." The girls spent the next several weekends dictating pages to Rhea, who typed them out between sips of tea and bites of toast. The entries were small, vivid, brimming with 8-year-old wisdom. "Daddy always drinks the bitter coffee but smiles when we give him the sweet one." Rhea reads books with words we don't understand, but she explains them like magic. "Hugo snores, but he's part of the family, so we just deal with it." Daniel read every page. Twice. Sometimes 3 times when the world felt too sharp. And he realized that somewhere along the way, his life had become a story worth telling. Not for the mergers, or the magazine covers, or the zeros on his portfolio, but for the quiet, the chosen family, the work of love made visible. Spring in Manhattan was a spectacle. Blooming trees burst across Central Park like confetti. Rhea's book was now out in the world, The Empty Chair, a title that made Daniel flinch the first time he read it, until he realized it wasn't about him. It was about the idea that healing doesn't fill what's missing. It makes space for what's next. The literary world responded with gentle applause. Reviews called it meditative and surprisingly hopeful. Her publisher requested a tour. She hesitated. Daniel told her she should go. "Will you be okay here?" she asked, eyes flickering to the girls. He nodded. "I think I can manage bedtime and burnt pancakes." "Don't let them eat cake for breakfast." "No promises." She left in April, just for 2 weeks, with Hugo reluctantly trailing her suitcase down the hallway. The girls waved from the balcony, Ria's plane slowly lifting into the sky. That night, Daniel found himself alone in the penthouse, the quiet strangely loud. He lasted 3 hours before calling her. She laughed when she answered. Already? Emma says the dog misses you. He's with me. I know. I just needed to hear your voice. She didn't say much after that. She just stayed on the line, and they listened to the silence together until they both fell asleep. Her tour became a quiet success. Small venues, intimate discussions, readings in cities she hadn't visited in years. But it wasn't the press that lit her up when she returned. It was the moment she opened the door to find Emma and Elise fast asleep on a blanket fort, Daniel sitting beside them, his laptop in his lap, a stuffed fox peeking from under the pillows. She dropped her bags and kissed him before saying anything. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't for effect. It just was. The girls stirred awake. You're home, Emma murmured. I am, Ria whispered, holding them both close. I always come back. The summer brought something unexpected. Daniel was offered a keynote at a global tech summit in Geneva, a chance to speak not just about innovation, but about leadership, vulnerability, and the importance of human-centered design. He hesitated, remembering the scrutiny that followed his last public speech. But Ria encouraged him. If you're not afraid to tell your story, no one can use it against you. He took the stage in June, wearing no tie, his sleeves rolled up, speaking not as the CEO, not as the billionaire, but as the father who had once nearly lost everything. I learned to build systems, he told the crowd. To build platforms. Then I had to learn how to build trust. That's harder. It's messier. But it's the only thing worth building. When the video hit the internet, it didn't go viral in the usual way. It didn't trend. But it spread quietly. In circles that mattered. Tech leaders started talking about ethical design again. About empathy. About accountability. It was a ripple, not a wave. But Daniel was learning that ripples had more staying power anyway. One evening, a month later, he returned home to find the girls and Ria sitting in the middle of the living room, surrounded by moving boxes. He froze. Are you? Ria looked up. I was thinking, maybe it's time we made this official. Daniel walked in, stunned. You're moving in? I've had a drawer here for 3 months, she said. It feels dishonest to pretend I don't live here. The girls cheered. Hugo barked once, as if giving his approval. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep amid half-unpacked boxes, Daniel and Ria sat on the balcony again. The city glowed below them, summer humming through the open air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring box. She blinked. Daniel. He opened it. Inside was a simple ring. No diamond. No flash. Just a band of silver and a carved fox, tiny and precise. You said we'd know when it was time, he said. And I think I woke up this morning, saw you brushing your teeth in my shirt, and thought, yeah, I can't imagine another sunrise without this. She stared at him for a long time. Then she took the box, closed it gently, and said, I'm going to ask you again in the morning. Just to be sure. He smiled. Fair enough. She leaned her head on his shoulder. But the answer's yes. The wedding, when it happened, wasn't public. No press. No announcements. Just a garden upstate, friends and family gathered under lanterns strung between trees, Elise and Emma wearing matching flower crowns they made themselves. Daniel didn't invite anyone from the boardroom. No investors. No headlines. Just his sister, a few childhood friends, Ria's colleagues, and their new family. They exchanged vows barefoot. Ria read hers from a folded piece of paper that had water stains from when she cried while writing it. Daniel spoke from memory, voice shaking when he said, You weren't the beginning of my story, but you changed the ending. The girls ran through bubbles afterward, dragging Hugo behind them in a flower-draped wagon. And later, when the night had quieted, and the guests had wandered off into starlit conversations, Rhea and Daniel sat on the grass with their hands linked between them, watching the moon rise. "There's something about building your life from scratch," she whispered. "You never stop being amazed when it holds." Daniel looked at her, his wife, and said, "I didn't build it alone." And she, smiling through tears, replied, "No, but you let someone in to help." The calm had finally arrived. Not because the world had stopped trying to undo them, but because they had stopped trying to face it alone. Autumn arrived with gold-tipped leaves and mornings kissed by fog, wrapping the Mercer Langford home in a hush that spoke not of endings but of the stillness that follows a great crescendo. The city outside kept moving, taxis blaring, phones buzzing, stock tickers flashing, but inside their world, something deeper had settled, not peace in the absence of chaos, but peace despite it. A kind earned, not given. Daniel stood on the terrace one morning, coffee warm in his hands, watching Emma and Elise chase Hugo across the backyard, the dog bounding like a puppy despite his years. Laughter spilled across the grass like wind chimes. There was something holy about that sound. Something he would never tire of. Rhea stepped beside him, still in her robe, barefoot and half asleep, and leaned into him with the sort of trust that took years to cultivate and seconds to recognize. Daniel took a long breath. "It feels like I was drowning for years, and I didn't even know it. And now every breath I take feels like the first one." She smiled, tracing a finger along the lip of his mug. "You earned it." He looked at her, eyes searching. "We did. Because this entire journey, had never been just his. It was forged in the quiet resilience of two little girls who learned to love again. In a woman who dared to step into a storm without armor. In the humility it took for a man who once believed he had everything to admit he needed more. Needed them. There were no more court summonses. No more threats whispered through lawyers' lips. Clarissa had vanished from their lives like a summer storm. Loud, disruptive, but ultimately fleeting. Her appeals collapsed under the weight of truth, and her allies, seeing no more headlines to feed on, disappeared just as quickly. It turned out the world didn't care about old drama when no one was watching anymore. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His victory wasn't a verdict. It was watching his daughters fall asleep each night knowing they were safe. It was waking up next to the woman he once met on a blind date while pretending to be someone else, and realizing she'd loved the version of him with the least to offer. That was the miracle, wasn't it? That Rhea hadn't fallen for the wealth, or the name, or the city view penthouse. She had fallen for the tired man with twins and tangled fears, the one who grilled sandwiches in a hoodie and whispered bedtime stories like he was trying to rewrite his past with each sentence. And in return, she gave him not just love, but legacy. Her book became a quiet classic, passed around in classrooms and book clubs, dissected not for its prose but for its depth. One reviewer wrote, "It is rare to find a story that aches with this much honesty but still dares to hope." Rhea read that line aloud to Daniel once, and he had to walk away because his throat closed up too fast to speak. As for the girls, they flourished. Emma declared she wanted to be a scientist who also wrote poems. Elise started building forts and writing rules for entry. Her club included only people who liked dogs and pancakes. They still had nightmares sometimes. They still flinched when certain memories crept in. But now, they had a home that absorbed those fears, not amplified them. Daniel never returned to the man he was before. He didn't want to. He stepped down as CEO 6 months later, not because he was tired, but because he finally understood what real wealth looked like, and he didn't need to trade his hours for approval anymore. The company didn't collapse. The world didn't end. And for the first time, he sat in the audience at his own gala without the weight of expectation pressing against his spine. He and Rhea launched a foundation together. One focused on educational access, mentorship, and healing trauma through storytelling. It was her idea, but he funded it without blinking. "We build bridges," she said once, "for kids who grew up thinking there was no way across." They called it the First Chair Fund, in honor of a line from her book. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can give a child isn't an answer, it's a seat at the table. Years passed, and the world kept spinning. The girls got taller. Hugo grew slower. The walls of their home filled with photographs and scribbled art, calendars cluttered with school projects and dinners with friends who'd become family. And in the center of it all, Daniel and Ria. No longer just the CEO and the professor. No longer the man pretending to be poor or the woman wondering if love could survive the wreckage. They were just two people, weathered but whole, who had chosen again and again not to run when it got hard. Who believed in the quiet work of loving, of staying, of showing up even when the past tried to pull them under. On their 10th anniversary, Ria gave Daniel a new journal. Inside the first page, in her soft handwriting, were the words, "This time, you write the ending." He looked up at her, eyes crinkled with years, voice thick. "And if I don't want it to end?" She leaned in, kissed the edge of his mouth. "Then just keep living the story." And so he did. Not as the man in the corner office or the face on the magazine, but as the father who danced barefoot in the kitchen, the husband who always made the coffee too strong, the man who stopped chasing legacy and instead built one from laughter, forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't shout, it stays. And somewhere, in a quiet room on a quiet night, someone opens a book or presses play on a video and hears this story. Not about a millionaire CEO. Not about custody battles or boardrooms or blind dates. But about what happens when a broken man finally lays down the mask. And someone dares to love what's underneath. And that's when everything changes.